Good evening and welcome to this edition of Africa in Focus with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian writer, broadcaster, historian, podcaster, and entrepreneur. And in this week's edition of Africa in Focus, it's a special. It's Africa Union Day, Africa Day. And we're going to give you a very interesting theme, subject, why the white man or the West keeps Africa down. Yeah. So why the white man does not want to see Africa united. Yeah. And so that is the theme for this week's podcast. And if you like what you hear, please share to your friends, family, social media networks. Subscribe to Ghana African Focus on YouTube. Subscribe to Ghana African Focus on Spotify. And if you'd like to help us continue to bring out some great content from Ghana and from Africa, you can donate as little as $3 a month, and that'll help us with our costs. So you can do that as a one-off payment, or you can do it for, a monthly installment for just $3 a month. All right, so let's get into this week's podcast: why the white man or the West keeps Africa down, and why the white man does not want to see Africa unified. So I'm going to put down a very, very powerful video at the footnotes to this podcast that will buttress, that will confirm what I'm going to say about why the white man keeps Africa down. Yeah, and this video is a presentation by an economics professor by the name of Howard Nicholas, who is professor of economics at Rotterdam University in the Netherlands. And he gave this lecture about, it went viral on YouTube about 3 or 4 years ago. And it really set the cat amongst the pigeons and exposed to us what we already knew, and so can you, about how the West, the white man, keeps Africa deliberately impoverished. So some of you, many of you, will probably believe the narrative that is spun in Western media. The reason why Africa is poor is because, corrupt leaders, bad governance, and, lack of, proper leadership. And this is a narrative that's been spun by the Western media for the best part of 50 years, to the extent that many Africans now believe it to be true, that the reason why Africa is not progressing as a continent, or the individual countries aren't progressing, is because of bad leadership, bad governments, and corrupt leaders. Now, they're saying if you tell a big enough lie and you keep the lie going for long enough, the people will believe it. So people have believed this lie, that the reason why Africa is where it is, i.e. impoverished, because not poverty, because Africa is rich, but I'll come to that in a minute, is because of these things of, bad leadership, bad governments, and corrupt leaders, strict dictators. Now, contrary to that narrative lies the truth. And the truth is that Africa is deliberately kept in an impoverished state. And this presentation by Howard Nicholas breaks it down perfectly, bit by bit, how the white man deliberately keeps Africa down. So before I go into some of my analysis as to why that is, if you recall, when we did the podcast about why the French must leave Africa, I made reference to 2 former French presidents. One, the first being François Mitterrand, who said way back in 1956 that without Africa, France will have no future in the 21st century. Jacques Chirac, former French president between 1995 and 2007, said that without Africa, France will slide to the realm of a third world state. So those 2 presidents' remarks show you how important Africa is to France. So if Africa is important to France, you don't think Africa is important to the world? And again, another quote I will give you. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the first black president long before Obama. Yeah, this American president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, had a mixed race mother called Ida Stover. He said, and this is why producer member was killed, yeah, he said that whoever controls the Congo controls Africa, whoever controls Africa controls the world. I want to say that again. Dwight D. Eisenhower, President of the United States in the 50s, former general, said, whoever controls the Congo controls Africa, and whoever controls Africa controls the world. So what does that show you about the importance of Africa to the global community, particularly to Western, economic prowesses and Western economic dominance? Now, in this lecture by Howard Nicholas, he says, and I quote, the West will never allow Africa to industrialize, because if Africa did industrialize and modernize itself, the standard and the quality of living in the West and in Asia would collapse overnight. So the quality of life, the standard of life that is enjoyed in the West, i.e. the USA, Canada, to a degree Mexico, the European Union, etc., and also Asia, i.e. China, Japan, South Korea, you can put in there Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, right? If Africa was to industrialize, right, the quality of life in all these areas will come down in a big time, yeah? And he states further that the West will never allow that to happen. He said Africans can try, but they'll be up against it, and the West will use whatever tricks it can muster to ensure that Africa never develops. So that alone, that opening paragraph alone, should tell you that there is an agenda by the West predominantly to keep Africa down, because the white man, the European, has never ever wanted to see the black man rise, because in his eyes, and this is why they enslaved us, this is why they used scientific racism to justify the enslavement of African people. In their eyes, in the white man's eyes, African people are inferior. Don't forget, they had all these theories which culminated in scientific racism, that because of the size of our brains and the color of our skin, African people were basically less intelligent than white people, and African people deserve to be treated like hewers of wood and drawers of water. Again, look at another reference. Rudyard Kipling, The White Man's Burden. Read that, you could say poem. Rudyard Kipling, The White Man's Burden. Yeah? Again, justifying their pillage of Africa. And so, like I said, the white man has never wanted the black man, the African, to rise, because they know, the elite know, right? Not necessarily the ordinary white person on the street, or even your teacher, your doctor, your friend, etc., right? They may not know, but the elite know that if Africa rises, that is game over for them, game over for the West. And they would never, ever allow an African country to arise. This is another reason why that the white man, like I said, wants to kill Ibn Traore. But I'll come to that just slightly in a second or two. This is why they had to move Kwame Nkrumah from power. Yeah, because Kwame Nkrumah was setting the example, the template, the Garveyite template, because Kwame Nkrumah said of all of the books that he studied and read, particularly while he was in America, the book that fired him up the most was the philosophy and opinion of Marcus Mosiah Garvey. So Nkrumah was a student of Garvey, yeah? And Nkrumah's program was essentially Garveyism manifested. And so because of this, idea to industrialize Ghana, which will then serve as a model and a blueprint for other African countries to follow. And because of Nkrumah's pan-African orientation, particularly towards African unity, and the consequence that could have for the Western hegemony in Africa, Nkrumah to go. Because had Nkrumah not been removed and was able to industrialize Ghana, because under Nkrumah, Ghana had a national development plan from 1962 to 2070. So with Nkrumah not being removed, even CIA documents, documents said that had Nkrumah not been removed from power, Ghana would have been a middle-income country in 1970. Look at that. By 1970, Ghana would have been a middle-income country. Think about that, folks. Think about that. So this is why Nkrumah had to go. Yeah, and had Nkrumah not gone, Ghana would be in a much better place today, and you would have had a United States of Africa, which would serve, yeah, as a force for good, and also it would serve as it would serve as Africa's place in the world, because Africa, a united Africa, will be able to compete with the European Union, with the USA, with China, India, what have you. Yeah, and this is what they feared: the United States of Africa. Africans coming together as one solid block, with one single currency, with one trading block, and also one African central bank. That was fearful for the Western hegemony. This is why they had to get rid of Nkrumah. To fast forward to today, we now see Ibrahim Traore, yeah, a modern day version of Kwame Nkrumah, and he's made many utterances of how the white man wants to keep us down and how they do not have any good intentions for Africa. So Ibrahim Traore is developing not just Burkina Faso, but also serving as an inspiration to other African leaders, along with Mali, Niger, and Senegal. Is serving as a model for other African countries to say, wake up. Yeah, wake up from your slumber. You know, you need to develop your country. You need to industrialize the country, because that's the only way that Africa can free itself from white domination, white terrorism. And so because Ibrahim Traore is saying these kind of things and is rapidly developing Burkina Faso, and by the way, he's actually paid all of Burkina Faso's debt within under less than 3 years. He's been in power for less than 3 years, but he's paid all of the debt that Burkina Faso owed. That's leadership. That's non-corrupt governments. Sorry, that's non-corrupt leader. That's good governments, and that's great leadership. And the white man don't like that. This is why they tried to kill him not once, but twice, but 20 times. And so this shows you that the white man does not want the African man or the black man to develop and rise above him, because if it did, right, that's it for the West. And so this is why they use all sorts of skullduggery and evil, nefarious deeds to keep Africa divided. Just give you 3 examples before I sort of go on to Howard Nicholas and other examples. You know, they start proxy wars in Africa. DR Congo is a classic example of proxy war. So they supply the weapons, yeah, and then they create tensions between rival factions, and then before you know it, there's a civil war. So right now in DR Congo, there's a war between the government of DR Congo, who are fighting rebels in the shape of the M23, who were armed initially by the West, but who recently have been supported by Paul Kagame's Rwanda. Yeah, and also Yoweri Museveni of Uganda. So you see how this works to destabilize Africa? by creating proxy wars. Secondly, you create friction or fraction or strife in a country that has great potential. Example being Nigeria. Nigeria has fantastic potential. If Nigeria had peace, Nigeria would be a powerhouse, yeah? Because some of the most intelligent people are in Nigeria. Igbos, Yorubas, Hausas, Fulani, Ijo, etc. Some of the most clever people, some of the most intelligent people, some of the most business-oriented people, some of the most brilliant minds are Igbo, Yoruba, Hausa, Ijo, etc., Fulani, etc. Now, if Nigeria was to experience, a peace, you would see Nigeria rapidly grow because they've got the people, the same thing got the intelligence and the capacity. They've also got more than 250 million people living there, and they've got, resources like gold and oil. And this is why, again, the West, the white man, they bankrolled and organized a group that was destabilize Nigeria to stop it from developing and reaching superpower status by funding a group called Boko Haram. And recently, it's just been, we need this anyway, but it's just been recently highlighted that under USAID, they were secretly funding money to Boko Haram. So you see, that's the second way in how they create instability within African countries. And the third thing, example I'll give you is famine. So they create a situation whereby, people are disfranchised, and because of certain nuances, famine situation arises, as what happened in Somalia, which I think a few years ago, there was a famine in Somalia, or food shortages. So again, trying to destabilize the country and stop it from developing and industrializing. So these are some of the ways and means in which Africa is kept down. Again, to butcher this, you can read a book or get the YouTube Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. Yeah, this is a former CIA agent who was the hitman for the CIA of America, who went to these African countries, particularly African countries, and said that, we've got a plan for you, right? And, we want you, right, to prioritize your mining companies so that it can benefit our multinational companies. And so the thing is that if you don't agree to our terms, three things will happen. We will kill you, or rather, we'll create, situation whereby we make your country ungovernable, like they did in the so-called Orange Revolution in Ukraine, that toppled the Ukrainian president and brought in this puppet, Zelensky. Many of you don't know he's a puppet. Zelensky's a puppet of the West. Or, if that doesn't work, we will persuade you to follow our plan and try and bribe you. Yeah, bribe you. Yeah? Like they do today with many African leaders. And if that doesn't work, they'll kill you. Yeah? They'll kill you like they did Gaddafi, like they did Saddam, like they did Magufuli. Magufuli was murdered. And even Thomas Sankara murdered. So that's how they do. That's how the hitman goes to African countries and does their job. Yeah, all designed to keep Africa in the position that it's in, as hewers of wood and drawers water. Now, when we analyze, Howard Nicholas' presentation, one very, very cogent and illuminating point that he made is that he said, all the economics that we teach predominantly Africans, right, in your school, in your college, in university, right, all the economics that we teach is designed to keep Africa down. I want to say that again, very, very poignant. All the economics that we teach in school, university, etc., is designed to keep Africa down. So why would they do that? Why would they deliberately have a you could say a system of economics that keeps Africa down? That is deliberately designed to keep Africa down. If there's no nefarious plan, no wicked intention behind that strategy of teaching economics to Africa to make it poor. Think about it, listeners. Think about that. So this is why Africa is impoverished, not because of bad leaders, not because of corrupt governments, not because of corrupt leaders, but because it is by design, by the white man, by the West, to keep Africa down. Because if Africa rises, their quality of life will shrink, and they cannot afford that. Can never afford that. So this is why on this African Liberation Day, we've got to understand these nuances of what's going on. These Western geopolitical games that have been played in Africa. DR Congo, Somalia, Central African Republic, Sudan. And we see, terrorism, that was funded by the West, particularly France, in the so-called Sahel. These Islamist terrorists. Who funded them? The West. Yeah? So these are nuances and ways in what they do to keep Africa down. So we've got to understand on this African Liberation Day, Africa Day, that we're not free. And the fight for sovereignty, the fight for self-determination, the right to control our destiny is what we are literally fighting for. And this is why we've got to support not just Ibrahim Traoré, but progressive African leaders like in Mali, like in Niger, in Senegal, and now we see in Namibia as well. We've got to literally support these leaders and literally fight for our land, because right now, again, as part of this plan to keep Africa impoverished, right, we don't own our land. A large chunk of our land is gone. The northern part of Africa is gone to the Arabs. Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and to an extent Mauritania, controlled by so-called Arabs. Southern Africa, Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, Zimbabwe, you want to throw in there Kenya in the east. Large chunks of this land is not owned by African people. And so in order to liberate ourselves, we've got to liberate our land. But before we can liberate our land, we've got to liberate our mind. Steve Biko once said, the greatest weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. I want to say that again. Steve Biko said, and I quote, the greatest weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And as long as our minds are messed up with this Western propaganda and this false education that we're getting, or miseducation that we're getting, right, we're not going to be able to free Africa. And a free Africa is anti the white man. Because a free Africa is going to wake up, smell the coffee, and do what it needs to do for its own survival. The white man's going to do what he's going to do for his own survival. What are we as Africans going to do for our survival? Because as the late, great African-American historian, John Henry Clark said, it says, Africans, you got no friends. So the white man, he definitely ain't your friend. China, India, Russia, Asia, they ain't your friends, beloved. Yeah, Putin might be one man, but he's just one man. And even Putin has his own agenda when he's dealing with Africa. Yes, he may not be dealing with you like the West, but he's still a white man. And you need to keep your third eye on Putin, because Putin is not an angel. Someone who's been in power for nearly 25 years is a cunning, tricky dog. Yeah, and a cunning, tricky dog cannot be trusted. And so we're going to keep an eye on Putin, not thinking that, he's doing from them, because he's still a white man and they're all the same. And so I'm going to leave it here, but please listen carefully and make notes regarding that presentation from Professor Howard Nichols, because he breaks it down nicely as to why the white man keeps Africa impoverished and why they are hell-bent on never, ever allowing Africa to industrialize and develop. Yeah? And so I thank you for listening to this special edition of Africa in Focus with myself, Kwame. Please subscribe to Ghana Africa in Focus on YouTube. Subscribe to Ghana Africa in Focus on Spotify. And if you do want to support the show, you can help us with our costs by donating as little as $3 a month. The link is in the footnotes to the show, so please donate if you would like to. So until next week, where we'll be looking at what we'll be looking at next week in Ghana in Focus. I think we'll be looking at Ghana in Focus. But anyway, we have another great content for you next week. So for myself, Kwame, and from all the crew here on Africa in Focus, is thank you for listening, and we see you for some more great content coming up.